As we are getting into spooky season, I have been spending a lot more time both thinking about and talking about a little niche of the fantasy genre that I really love, that I highlighted recently in my 5-star audit video, and that is fantasy stories typically set in our real world, so contemporary fantasy, that feature a magical element that falls into the realm of witchcraft in terms of things like maybe Wicca, the occult in general, like demon summoning, psychic abilities definitely fit into this, some types of ghost stories depending on how they're executed. And I'm definitely adding more of these books to my TBR right now and eyeing them up on my shelves. But today I want to share with you 5 books that fit into this niche that I have read, really enjoyed, and would love it if you guys would pick up this spooky season. Weirdly, I typically enjoy these kind of books in the YA space. It is one area of young adult fantasy that I still really enjoy, whereas young adult high fantasy or like more dystopian leaning stories or romantasy, I've strayed away from a lot. I still keep coming back to this niche time and time again in the YA space because I feel like the combination of the young adult demographic and the witchy occult contemporary fantasy vibes reminds me a lot of other media that I really enjoy. Movies like 90s cult classics like The Craft, or TV shows that I've really enjoyed in the past. Now, we could say things like The Vampire Diaries. Vampires don't really fit into this category for me. That's definitely more of a different paranormal lean, very adjacent, but not quite the same in terms of the vibes. But I feel like the witchcraft represented in things like Vampire Diaries works to some degree. Riverdale, even though when that got fantastical, it got a little bit out of hand and way too ridiculous. And so I feel like when I read young adult stories like this, they almost take on this movie-like, TV show-like quality for me that I really enjoy reading. That being said, there are a couple of books I'm recommending today that are of course adult, and I do feel like this niche lends itself really well to the new adult demographic because I particularly love it when these themes are paired with something like a university setting, especially if it's some sort of like sorority as seen in The Ravens by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page, or like a secret society kind of element, which we may be dealing with in one of the books today. But this is technically a follow-up video. I did look back on my channel and I have done a video in the past, I think in 2021 or 2022, recommending books that also fit into this category. So if you would like more recommendations, then you can go ahead and check out that video. I actually looked back on that video to see what I recommended, so we had no repeats, and I looked very different then. It was a little bit of a shock to the system, honestly. But getting into it, there is one that I do not own. This is one of the adult books, and it is probably one of the first books that I remember reading in the last, like, let's say 8 years, which is how long I've been on BookTube. And I did get this from the library. I keep meaning to get myself a physical copy, but I haven't yet, and that is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. This one is a tournament of magicians. Obviously, magicians is on the front. It's set in New York City, which honestly, New York City is a great backdrop for these kind of books, but it is following this tournament that happens every 10 or 20 years where the power transfers to a different magical family in New York City. I do actually have another book coming up in this recommendations video that does have a similar premise to this, thinking about it. But essentially it's time for this tournament to begin, and every group, every family has selected their champion to be the person who participates in this tournament to be their best chance of gaining the power for the next however many years it is. And it was a while ago that I read this. I want to say I read this in like 2018 or 2019. It was a standalone at the time of me reading it, but there has since been a sequel release that I haven't picked up yet, but I would like to reread book 1 and also then read the sequel. But I can't remember how exactly it's narrated, whether it's multi-perspective. I'm pretty sure it's like a third person view, but one of the main characters that we follow in here is a woman who has just arrived in New York City and thrown her hat into the ring of this tournament. It is very clear that she is a very, very skilled, very talented magician, and she has all of these prestigious families quaking in their boots when this newcomer just comes into town to shake everything up. And obviously they do not want to lose this power that they've been passing between families for generations, so they really want to know who this person is and eliminate her from the competition. This one is one that's a little bit more fast-paced and a little bit more vague and ambiguous than I typically like. Y'all know I don't like things that leave anything open to interpretation, that are a little bit more wishy-washy, and I feel like the nature of the magic, as well as the fact that this is a relatively slender book, I'd say it's in the realm of an average size book, like 300 to 450 pages, somewhere around there. So like it's just a normal size novel, and we have this big story arc of the tournaments and also this mysterious character. So I feel like it does go a little bit faster than my typical pace, and I generally like a really slow build. But I feel like the beauty of the fact that these books are set in contemporary worlds, it means you don't have to do as much world building. You just have to really explain to the reader how this magical element fits into the real world, and the rest obviously doesn't need to be said. So I feel like this worked for me in that I kind of let go of all of the expectations and requirements I have for a lot of fantasy stories, and I was just along for the ride, and I really enjoyed the way that this one played out. I got it from my library, I think, originally, so maybe I'll get it out again, reread, or maybe I'll finally get myself a copy and also pick up that sequel soon. I guess while we're here, the next book I should talk about is the one that I said had a very similar premise, and that is Oliver's Villains. This is a duology, and once again I do find that this is one of the rare instances where having a duology or a standalone story in a fantasy genre really works for me, because we don't need that world building. Usually a fantasy duology is not for me, especially if you do have like a rich world that you're building as well as like a magic system, because I just don't feel like there's enough page space in an average size novel to fully then complete a story arc within 2 books. But because we don't have the fantastical worlds in here, it does often work for me. The Ravens by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page once again is a duology. Now once again, I have not read the sequel to this book. I did start it, but it was released at a time when I was in a bad place mentally, so I didn't keep up with it and kind of just had to let it slide. So I do want to get back to this at some point, once again reread this and read the sequel. And I actually can't remember if this is on my reread and resume TBR that I made, which is a bunch of series where I want to reread the first book so I can continue on and finish the series, because I really enjoyed book 1. But this one is set in a small town, and I can't remember if it's like explicitly set in the UK, but it definitely feels like the UK. Amanda Foody and C.L. Herman, I'm pretty sure, are both American. And this is following a group of families, once again magical families, who live in this very sleepy town, and this town normally sees no action. But once again, every 10 or 20 years there is a tournament that takes place where each family nominates a teenager, so one of the youngest and most gifted and talented from their line, to participate in this tournament to the death, and whoever is the last one standing wins the control of the magic for their family for the next, once again, 10 to 20 years. The reason why this tournament in particular is different is because some anonymous person has wrote an expose on this magical tournament that happens in this town. And so this year they have a bunch of spectators. People have come from far and wide to watch this tournament unfold, and the tournament itself takes place in this protected area where people can't really see, but they're watching the happenings like around the tournament while it is ongoing, and we are following obviously the people who are participated in it, as they're also trying to get to the bottom of who wrote the expose, but also fighting to the death for control of the magic. This one is, I can't remember whether it's like firmly young adult or whether it would quite comfortably sit in a new adult space. Like I said, they are all teenagers, but I think they're a little bit on the older side. I really liked the vibes of this one. With it being set in a small town as opposed to like New York City with an unkindness of magicians, it had a very different feel with that small town vibe. I'm pretty sure one of the meeting places they go to in here is like the Village pub, and I feel like having very similar stories, weirdly having similar stories on very opposite backdrops, still created the same kind of effect, where in this, they're in like this village, this very small town, so nothing really happens there, so the majority of people who live there aren't really paying attention. Whereas in New York City, everything is happening there, so people don't pay attention because they're used to seeing like the wildest things, and nobody cares. Everybody's just getting on with their own business, and it's weird that these two opposite settings created almost the same effect. But this one I feel like is really perfect for the season because of the atmosphere of this town and like the atmosphere that the authors create within the scope of this book. When I first identified this niche as one that I really enjoyed, I couldn't think of any adult books I'd read that fit into this category, because I felt like adult books very much lent into the urban fantasy or paranormal genre, which has different conventions that I typically actually don't really like. But I did think of one that fits the bill perfectly. One of my favorite series that I've read over recent years. I think I give all of them 4 stars, so it's not perfect, but it's still one that I recommend frequently. And that is, of course, Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. So this one one, it's set in the UK, but it's very special to my heart because it's set in the north. A lot of the locations here are very familiar. They're very close to where I grew up. The centre of this magical coven, Her Majesty's Royal Coven, is the UK's governing body of witches in here, but the headquarters are in Manchester, which is my home city. I grew up like 30 minutes outside of Manchester, and the bulk of the book is actually set in Yorkshire, which is where I live now, although it's like a different part of Yorkshire. So this is really special to me because of that, and I feel like the UK vibes are very much present, like the northern UK vibes are very dominant in here. But this one is following a group of witches who used to be a coven, so they grew up together in the same small town in Yorkshire. They were very close, they were each other's first coven, but in the history of this world there has been a war between the witches and the warlocks, and that was multiple years before the start of this. I think the majority of these women they're all pretty much the same age, and I think they're all like in their 30s, which is nice to have like slightly older protagonists as well. I think they're on like the mid to later end of their 30s as well, and they have all suffered some sort of trauma from this war. It happened when they were in their 20s, so like a big part of their early adult years, and they've all gone in very different directions in life, but they still stay in touch. They're still relatively close because of the bonds that they built in childhood, and also the fact that they went through this horrific war together. Now, the key plot of this book is that one of the witches, Helena, who is now the high priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven, has found a child, and she's also discovered a prophecy. The prophecy says that the sullied child is going to summon the demon that brings about the end of days. So she gets in contact with her childhood friend Neve, who is a vet in Yorkshire. She uses her magic to help the animals, which I love, and she asks Neve to rehabilitate this child because they're very angry, they're very closed off, they're very volatile, and Helena thinks that Neve is the right person to be able to coax this child out, make them feel safe and rehabilitate them so they don't become the sullied child that brings about the end of days. However, that is not quite how this plays out, and there is a bunch of other complications thrown into the mix. This one deals a lot with inclusivity. It is a very diverse read. It's also a political one that I think is especially relevant to what is happening in the UK right now regarding things like the rights of trans people in this country, and I really like the way that the discussions were handled in here and represented, because if we compare this to something like Babel by R.F. Kuang, which deals mainly with racism and colonialism, the way that the messages were portrayed in there was very, very heavy-handed, which is a complaint a lot of people have, but I feel like this one is a little bit more subtle. Like, there's no hiding what this is about, but it is just a natural part that's woven into the narrative of this. This is still a fantasy book that has a fantasy plot line. The messages don't feel completely alien to what is going on here, and Juno Dawson doesn't hammer in like every single message. Like, it's quite clear to the reader like what is going on here without the need to underpin every point of this book with like an explanation of why it's wrong. Then we also have complications in the story of this because it ties into the past. It ties into this war that they had with the warlocks and some of the people that they left behind during that war that are maybe resurfacing. Every book in this series ends on a massive cliffhanger, and it kills me every single time, and I'm pretty sure in a box over there ready for my September unboxing is the third book in this series so that I can finally read it. I'm very, very excited, and I think of all the books I'm recommending today, this series is my favorite and the one that I would most recommend that you pick up. The next two books I'm going to recommend in this video are very different, both from everything that we have talked about so far today, but also very different from each other. The first one is a little bit of a dark academia read, which is perfect for this time of year, and that is The Whispering Dark by Kelly Andrew. This was an Illumicrate book from many, many years ago that I read recently, expecting absolutely nothing from it. It is a standalone, which I think was adequate. I would have maybe liked it to be slightly longer, but it delivered in a way that I did not expect. So this one is following a main character who is deaf, and she is treated like she's fragile by everybody around her. So when she's accepted into a prestigious program in a university, she sees this as an opportunity to prove that she is not any less capable than anybody else. And this prestigious program in particular is designed to train people to slip between parallel worlds and dimensions. So this is a well-known kind of fact that this university offers this program, but it is kind of seen as a joke. Nobody thinks it's actually real because nobody can prove that they've been to these parallel worlds. It's not something that you can show off and prove exists, but our main character takes it on faith, and when she's there she meets this guy who she immediately seems to piss off. Like, he is irritated by her presence, and she cannot for the life of her figure out why. Like, like why this guy hates her so much. But I'm pretty sure that he is actually a teaching assistant, and he has been warned by the person who runs this department that he needs to stay away from this new girl because he is a lot more deeply entrenched in this program than our main character Delaney is. And it also becomes clear throughout the course of this book that they also have a past together that Delaney doesn't recall, but very, very deeply affected our male main character Colton's life. The two of them are trying to stay away from each other when Delaney clocks on that this guy just really doesn't want anything to do with her, and he of course has been ordered to stay away from her. But all that changes when students are being murdered and they team up to try and get to the bottom of what is going on. So I would say that this one is more supernatural, and supernatural I feel does very much fit into these vibes, but I feel like it very much depends on the execution of them, to which kind of genre they fall into, whether they have this like contemporary occult vibe to them that I feel like this does, or whether they feel like they stray more into the conventions of something like paranormal or urban fantasy, or even like the horror genre, where I feel like this very much walks the line where it can still fit into this category but would also be quite comfortable slotting into other spaces as well. I really liked the atmosphere in this one. I love an atmospheric dark academia. I do see things in my mind when I read. I see more like colors, like things have a color palette. This would be like a moody, desaturated, almost grayscale kind of book, if that makes any sense to anyone. It's weird actually because I don't remember color very well, but that is very much the way that I remember the feeling of reading books. But I also really liked the romance that we had in here, because yes, it does have a very strong romantic subplot, and I do love a man who pines but also a man who falls first. And as he remembers this little nugget of the past that they shared and she doesn't, he is definitely more drawn to her than she is drawn to him, even though he is supposed to be resisting her and staying away from her at all costs. And then the final book is a young adult fantasy that once again I read recently. I expected absolutely nothing from it. I actually thought it was one that I was going to either DNF or read and immediately unhaul, but I really enjoyed it, and that is This Poison Heart by Kaylin Bayron. Now this is very solidly in the realm of young adult fantasy, and it's also very different from the books we've discussed today, because this is a character who has a more inherent magical ability. Go please, Mama's working. As opposed to something like Wicca or witchcraft, or like directly related to the occult. But this one is set in modern day New York State. It is following this girl who lives in Brooklyn with her family, and she has this woman visit their house who tells her that she's going to inherit an estate from, I think, an aunt of hers, and they have no idea what this estate is going to be, whether it's going to be like a grand amount of money, a house, or a box of junk. So they travel to upstate New York and they find out that Briasis, I think is her name, her aunt has left her a sprawling estate, and Briasis has an ability that she has been trying to hide, has caused her a lot of trouble at home, especially because her parents run a flower shop where every plant that she encounters grows, and this can be reflected by her mood. So she's in a bad mood and then the trees might start to bend towards her, and it's obviously something that is very difficult for her to hide and has caused a lot of friction between people around her who have noticed this happening. So when she goes to this estate, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, and discovers an apothecary in the house and also a poison garden that she can flourish to help stock this apothecary, she learns to really embrace her abilities and harness them in a way where she's not constantly being watched and constantly scared of people discovering her abilities. But also she discovers that this community in this small town that she's now a part of, this ability is something that is celebrated and that the community have been relying on for a very long time. But there are some other people who kind of covet this ability, or the product of what Briasis can achieve, and they are hunting her down for their own purposes. Now, the root of this is Greek mythology as opposed to witchcraft, but I feel like in execution this has a similar kind of style to the contemporary fantasy witchcraft, faster moving plots than I typically enjoy. Once again, with it being a contemporary fantasy, we don't have to do the world building of a grander, epic, high fantasy world. And the Greek mythology, I would say, is something that is relatively well known, obviously, in culture, so it still fits in the realm of a type of fantasy that you don't have to do a great amount of world building to be able to include in a story. Once again, this is a duology. I'm actually hoping to read the sequel this month if all goes to plan, so that I can see how this one wraps up, because this is a faster paced young adult story. I feel like this is one where I want to prioritize reading the sequel a little bit sooner. This plot was a little bit chaotic and I found the dialogue a little bit cheesy in times. I also don't think that this one is as atmospheric as the others. I don't think that this is one that you necessarily have to read during the autumn because it has those kind of vibes. This is one that fits into this niche that I think that you could save for spring or summer if you wanted to spread these kind of books throughout the year, especially with this theme of like growth. I think a spring or summer read would be a really good fit for this series actually, but it wouldn't be incredibly out of place if you wanted to read it over the next couple of months. And overall, I think I was just surprised by how much I enjoyed this and how much I got invested in the plot when I thought that this was going to be like a throwaway young adult fantasy for me. So those are 5 books that I really enjoyed that fit this little niche that I like of contemporary fantasy with occult elements. Like I said, I have done kind of like a first part to this with 5 more recommendations of books that fit this niche if you would like to learn about more books in this genre that I've really enjoyed. Down in my comments, please recommend me any books that you have read and really enjoyed that you think would fit into this little niche category. I was thinking about making a TBR video, but I have just posted an autumnal TBR on my channel, and I feel like by the time I got around to posting like a very specific like occult book TBR, the season's like, well, by the time I get it into my schedule, the season's gonna be pretty much over. But I do have Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which I think is perfect. All the Devils by Caitlin Wilson is a dark academia one that I want to read sometime soon. So yeah, let me know if there are any books that you feel would fit that I may really enjoy. But aside from that, guys, if you would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, please leave me a plant emoji for this poison heart. But aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you'd like to follow me on any of those. So that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.